Well, if you just think about what you have done this morning, so you woke up, you checked your emails, you turned on the lights, you charged your phone, you checked the news on your phone. All of that is linked to undersea cables. So imagine just spending one day or even 1 hour without connectivity, because we've become so used to this kind of life, and because modern life is set up around connectivity, digital connectivity. It's impossible to imagine life without it.
Elisabeth, it's lovely to talk to you again. Now, you recently wrote about 6 undersea cables that were damaged in just a few days in the Baltic Sea. How serious is that?
It's incredibly serious. So we have had in recent years, not that many years, the past 2 or 3 years, we've had a number of cables damaged or cut in the Baltic Sea, but also off the coast of Taiwan, especially the Matsu Islands, which are part of Taiwan, and also in the Red Sea. But if it's one cable, it's all right, because most cables have a twin that then takes over the traffic, or it can be rerouted to a competitor's cable. But if it's 6 cables connecting a country, then it becomes serious, which is what happened around New Year's Eve this past year. And that country was Estonia, and all countries are dependent on undersea cables. But a small country like Estonia doesn't have dozens of cables. It has a smaller number. And so if it's six cables that are out of service, either entirely cut or damaged, then it's also a serious matter, because you don't know how long it's going to take the repairmen to get to all these cables, because cable repairmen are very busy.
I mean, you note that these attacks often happen when the world's focused elsewhere. Do you think that distraction is now a deliberate part of global sabotage strategy?
We may never be able to prove that anyone damaged cables intentionally, even when it looks entirely obvious that it was done intentionally. So what we've seen in the Baltic Sea and in Taiwanese waters is that vessels, whether fishing boats or cargo vessels, have behaved very suspiciously around cables. They've dragged the anchors for dozens of kilometers or miles. That's not something you do. A seafarer knows when the anchor is dragging, but these seafarers have said, "Oh, I had no idea the anchor was dragging," and you can't prove that they knew. And so the affected countries may never be able to prove that it was done intentionally. But what is obvious is that the number of seafarers who apparently can't tell when they are close to cables and dragging their anchors, that number has exploded, as it were. So what seems obvious is that the number of seafarers who are just apparently incredibly sloppy and unprofessional has increased quite significantly. And you can say, well, that may be an accident. Most officials don't think it is an accident. The Baltic Sea functioned perfectly fine until about 2022. In fact, until 2022, there was only the occasional cable that was damaged. Now, all of a sudden, cables are damaged regularly and several at a time. So there seems to be something going on. But again, it's incredibly hard to prove. The Finns have tried it in a court of law, and it was difficult, also because these incidents take place in the exclusive economic zone, which for any students of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea may know is not within a country's jurisdiction. So even if you can prove intentionality, it's not within your jurisdiction. So it's all incredibly complicated. But something is happening, which then raises the question what we can do about it.
So, Elisabeth, paint the picture for us. If multiple major cables were cut globally, what would people actually experience in daily life? How would it affect us?
Well, if you just think about what you have done this morning, so you woke up, you checked your emails, you turned on the lights, you charged your phone, you checked the news on your phone. All of that is linked to undersea cables. Obviously connectivity, but also power, because we get electricity from undersea electricity cables. So if you imagine life without any sort of connectivity, and by the way, that also applies to Apple Pay, credit cards, that kind of thing, because they are connected to the payment system through connectivity through cables. All of that would disappear. So imagine just spending one day or even 1 hour without connectivity and without electricity. I think you would struggle to get that hour to pass. I hope you have books at home, but it is for us, for every one of us, because we have become so used to this kind of life, and because modern life is set up around connectivity, digital connectivity. It's impossible to imagine life without it.
And how quickly could a regional disruption turn into a cascading global internet outage? And how fast before we could get back online again?
Yes. So what happens when a cable is cut is that it affects the two countries that are connected by that cable, and globe spanning cables typically make landfall, as it were, are connected to various countries on the way. So let's say a cable connecting Asia with Europe doesn't just connect at one point in, let's say, India, and then travel all the way to the UK without stopping anywhere else. There are landing stations along the way, so that those countries can be connected by that cable too. That has the advantage of connecting lots of countries, but it also has the advantage that if a cable is cut, it's just the section between those two landing points, because then it's essentially a new part that continues. So that section would obviously be out of service. But the problem is that if a ship, for example, drags its anchor across the seabed in a particular body of water, then as well as striking one cable, it can strike several cables, which is what happened in the Baltic Sea, or in the Gulf of Finland, which is a sort of an extension of the Baltic Sea, around New Year's Eve. And so that country, or those countries, are likely to be severely affected. And that is incredibly bad for people and companies and government services, everything within those two countries. But what happens if those two countries, for example, can't make payments, which obviously requires undersea cables? What if they can't conduct other business with the rest of the world? And we should remember that all business depends on connectivity too, especially the financial services sector, where the money travels through the cables. With manufacturing, obviously, you conduct your transactions, emails, and so forth through cables, orders, and so forth. But you send your product on ships with money. You send the money through the cables. So other countries would then also be affected, because those first countries would be unable to operate. This is something that countries just, there is no preparation for it, simply because the prospect has been so unlikely. But now it doesn't seem that unlikely anymore.
Because we're looking beyond slow internet, as you say, it's whole finance systems, it's aviation, it's healthcare, it's government communications. Is there any way that individuals, what should you and I be thinking of in terms of preparation? I mean, is this gold bars under the bed, or is there absolutely nothing we can do to be ready for this?
I started becoming aware of disruption when I lived in San Francisco, which was for 5 years in the beginning of the century. And in San Francisco, the city had constant awareness campaigns about what to do in case of an earthquake. And so you should have canned goods at home, water, a torch, a blanket. You should know where to meet, how to find your loved ones and friends after the earthquake, because the phone network would not be usable. And the same thing is true for us today, 20 years later. In case of a severe cable outage, we would need to feed ourselves, have enough money, have cash at home, have enough food at home, have water, have a plan for how to reach friends and loved ones, because those services will not function. And it sounds a bit preppy to say, well, you should have a connectivity plan with your friends and loved ones. But if the phone is down, if the phone system is down, and by the way, the phone system is dependent on undersea cables as well. And of course, most of us use internet messaging anyway, or app messaging anyway. You need to have a plan for how to get in touch with people. That is the sort of preparedness I think everybody can stomach, as it were. And a number of countries now have leaflets describing exactly what you should do in a crisis, and that includes a crisis when the internet goes down. The UK also has such an instruction booklet, by the way, but hasn't been sent to people. It's on the government on gov.uk, which you obviously wouldn't be able to access in case the internet went down. So there are things we can do, but in terms of getting the internet back on your own, that's just not possible. And nobody has a private undersea cable. Some people have thought about, should I subscribe to Starlink? Well, satellites are just not a viable alternative to undersea cables. They are space is already incredibly crowded. Connectivity provided by satellites is slower, has less capacity. So that is not a solution. And of course, satellite connectivity can be disrupted too.
So there have been deterrence measures like Baltic Sentry, and that appeared to work for a time. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that and why it's faltering?
Yes, so Baltic Sentry is one of the initiatives I described earlier, the things that the Baltic states have come up with on their own. And Baltic Sentry is essentially Baltic nations patrolling the Baltic Sea, especially the undersea infrastructure. And they can't be everywhere all the time. There are many more cables in the Baltic Sea than can constantly be watched by Baltic Sentry. But it's essentially like, your neighborhood police officer who walks, takes daily walks in the neighborhood just to show that he or she is there. And that helps the police seeing and knowing what is going on, but also has a deterrent effect. And in the Baltic Sea, it really has worked quite well in combination with other initiatives, for example, something called Nordic Warden, which is an AI surveillance tool. And the challenge is proving a negative. So we don't know how many cable incidents Baltic Sentry and these other initiatives have prevented or deterred, simply because we don't know how many were planned. But it's good to have it. And I think what is really worth noting is that this is, even though it's done within NATO, it is executed by those countries alone. It doesn't require the involvement of any of the other NATO member states, which I think points to the future of NATO, where countries can get together in their region to say, this is a problem that we have, this is what we're going to do about it. And I think it's also worth highlighting that Baltic Sentry uses these different member states' vessels. They put them at the disposal of Baltic Sentry. And that means that they can't do other things that they might have needed to do otherwise. Instead, they're patrolling undersea infrastructure. And that is a very difficult balancing act, because navies are needed for things other than patrolling undersea infrastructure.
You mentioned NATO there. If NATO is distracted or politically constrained, is there a sort of global body who's actually responsible for protecting this infrastructure?
There is no body that is responsible for the protection of infrastructure, and nor is NATO, because NATO is a military alliance that is there to defend the territory of its member states. And undersea cables are on the seabed in territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, and international waters. And there's no international organization that is in charge of protecting them, nor is there any sort of military alliance that's in charge of protecting them. And that has worked all these decades because nations decided that it was in everybody's interest to allow undersea cables to operate. Obviously, during World War I, World War II, the different sides targeted undersea infrastructure. They also tapped into them. and essentially to listen to adversaries' communications. But that was during war, and the cables survived World War One, they survived World War Two, and they survived the Cold War. And here we are today worrying about whether they're going to survive our era, which is really quite extraordinary. And again, there is no international body in charge of protecting them. There is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, but it depends on countries essentially prosecuting vessels that have damaged undersea cables. Well, what if those countries refuse to investigate and prosecute? Then there are no consequences. And that is a reality today.
Yeah. So finally, Elisabeth, what would it take, short of chaos, for undersea cable security to be treated as a top-tier national and global priority?
I think if US cables were to be damaged by somebody under mysterious circumstances, then the Americans would wake up to this risk and take action. I don't think we'll see a situation where the global community of nations comes together and says, we have to do something about this. The world is just too divided at the moment. But we will see, I think, individual countries pay attention. And it's interesting, by the way, that in the US Senate, concerns are growing about the security of undersea cables, and on the government side. So actually, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, they are concerned about Chinese parts in US-owned undersea cables, which really tells you something about the state of the world today. It's not globalization where, manufacturing can happen anywhere and in international supply chains and so forth. Now, Chinese parts in US supply chains have become a concern. So I think in terms of there becoming a sort of a massive global call to arms against undersea saboteurs, it would essentially require cables off the coast of New York, off the coast of Chinese East Coast, something like that, to be harmed at the same time. But actually, awareness and alarm is growing are growing quite rapidly already. It's, I think, also powered by the sort of global fascination with these cable sea cuts in the Baltic Sea that everybody could follow. The courtesy of undersea cables, everybody could follow on marine trackers on the news and so forth. And many people realize that, this is serious.
Extremely serious. Elisabeth, many thanks for explaining it to us. That's Elisabeth Braw.